My guest, Helen Bauer, has spent over 15 years as a hospice nurse working alongside families and patients during life's most profound transitions. She's the voice behind the Heart of Hospice podcast, a platform where she breaks down the complexities of hospice care and grief with compassion and clarity. Beyond her podcast, Helen is the owner of Hospice Navigation Services, where she offers guidance to families making difficult end-of-life decisions. She also brings her personal perspective as a caregiver for her 91-year-old mom, bringing together her professional expertise and her personal life to help others face end-of-life care. Today, Helen shares her caregiving story. We talk about the misconceptions of hospice. How do we have these hard conversations? How do we balance life as a caregiver, navigating grief? And we get to learn from the wisdom that Helen has gained from walking this path herself. Here is my interview with Helen Bauer. Hi, Helen. We were just visiting and went, oh my gosh, we need to start our interview. So this is so fun that we start this way already with such great conversation and connection. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Happy to have you. I'm looking forward to this, your insight, your rich knowledge around and such an important topic. And I know that comes from a personal place. So I would love for you to share with us more about your personal story, caregiving with your mom, how it's shaped your perspective. Tell us about your work, all the things.
Well, I've been a nurse for almost 35 years, which makes me sound so old, but I've been in hospice and end of life care for 15 years. I'm hospice and palliative care certified as a registered nurse, and I've been working in community-based hospice for all these years. I have a background in bedside care and management and regulatory and compliance specialist. So I've done a little bit of everything, and now I work as an end-of-life educator and an advocate.
Mm.
And my personal journey has sort of gone from being very distant to being parallel to really intersecting with what caregivers do. Because my mom is now 91, and I'm the youngest of three siblings. I have two boomer siblings who are fantastic as fellow caregivers. And my mother has dementia, which sort of crept in because she was living independently. And little by little, we noticed in her conversation, as we began to talk more about who she was, that she was changing. Her cognition was changing. Her logical thinking, decision making, and memory skills were changing. And over the last 6 to 8 months, my mom has had a really drastic decline. So my siblings and I have really had to ramp up our caregiving.
Oh, oh, it's so hard. And those changes come over time, but I think there are those moments where it does really hit us, just kind of the weight of all of it and having to come in and, yeah, provide that support. It's a lot.
We knew that she was changing, and we had started to communicate more with each other. We've always been good about, texting and conference calls. It's easy to stay connected to do these things. But my sister had used the phrase, she has a lazy brain. And
Mm.
we thought it was related to not socializing, not reading enough, maybe not a great diet. And she used to be a smoker years ago. And I would correct her, but I didn't want to push it too far because her doctor, my mother's doctor, hadn't diagnosed her. And I really didn't think that it was a quote unquote lazy brain. I really felt like it was aging. So, about a year ago, when we realized it was dementia, I really began to see the changes in her. And the week that I put that diagnosis on my radar, I dropped my garage door down on my car twice.
Oh,
I,
so
you know, I w- hadn't pulled my car in far enough to the garage. And I look back now and I realized I was sad and distracted. And I know what that looks like to have a loved one that ages through a dementia diagnosis. And I think it was just grief.
yeah, completely, completely. When you got that diagnosis or knew more definitively, did you reach out to certain resources that supported you? Because I know with your work, you had a lot of interaction, right, with that diagnosis. But when it's personal, did you find that you needed, I don't know, more education or support or understanding in that way?
I did. I did. And what I found is there's so much strength in the caregiving community. I had friends that were really just business acquaintances through the podcast who said, "Here's my number. Call me when you need to vent, scream, cuss, cry about your mom." And I just had all these people act as supporters and say, "Look, I'm a member of this group," or "We found this resource to be great," or "Have you looked into doing this with your mom?" And it was just this unexpected community with so much strength and support. I've really been blown away.
I'm so happy for you that you have that, right? That network. It is. The community is amazing. And once we, I think, look for it, we realize how much is there. Yeah.
Right. It was amazing to see the number of people. I mean, I know the number, right? There are over 55 million unpaid family caregivers in the United States. But that's just a statistic until you're doing it yourself and you have other people reach out to you and say, "Hey, I'm raising my hand. I'm doing the same thing."
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you worked as a hospice nurse and in the different roles that you had, what was the moment where you decided, I'm going to start a podcast, the Heart of Hospice podcast? And I would just love to hear how that community has grown for you through this platform that you've created.
The podcast was the brainchild of a friend of mine that I used to work with. He was a hospice chaplain. And initially, he was a co host and planned all the content with me. But he said, "You're a podcast listener. There are not any great podcasts out there about hospice. Somebody should have a hospice podcast." And here I am, a nurse. I'm not a public speaker. I said, "Oh, yeah, yeah. Somebody should do a podcast about hospice." So a few weeks later, he said, "We could do a podcast about hospice." And that was the point where I jumped and I said, "Absolutely not. If you put a microphone in front of me, I'm going to have a heart attack. I can teach at the bedside for hours, but if you're going to tell me you're recording it, I can't do that." But we really powered forward with it. We felt like there was such a need out there. We're in season 9, in the middle of season 9 started in August of 24. And what we realized is there's this huge need. We never run out of guests. We have people interact and say, "Man, this really resonated. This I needed to hear." And the podcast just supplies a need that other mediums don't reach
Yeah.
because it's on the go. It's free. You can consume it in a 10-minute drive to the grocery store or an hour-long walk. You can search the topic that you need to hear about. And that's what we know about caregivers. They don't
Yeah.
have a lot of time. A lot of times they're financially strapped. They need something they can listen to on the fly, maybe sometimes go straight to one topic if they want to talk about dementia or they want to talk about advanced care planning. So podcasts are really a great resource. And we've been able to be really successful and connect with these awesome people doing the kind of work that we do.
I agree. It is such a wonderful medium. It's one I absorb all the time myself, but then obviously as a podcaster, um, know just how much benefit and education and how much I've learned. And I think that it is you specifically for caregivers, right? To be able to put an AirPod in and listen while you're going for a walk or doing laundry or whatever it is. I think it's a way that is such a way to connect and easily digestible, and it's not a barrier to to understanding and to hearing that. So I'm so
Right.
happy. Yeah, I'm so glad you decided to do it. Yeah.
And I love doing it, right? I connect with these people doing amazing work. Another thing about it being a podcast, the way it can be consumed by the listener is it's recorded and it's sitting there. You can always go back to it. Caregivers don't always have a lot of mental bandwidth because of the work that they're doing. the care that they're taking of their person. So to be able to go back and reinforce and listen to something again, I've done that with other podcasts if it's a topic I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
That way they can always go back and touch back into a piece that they really needed.
Great reminder we can do that. So important. With hospice, I have found in my life that when I've had different conversations with people or family members, there's a hesitation to involve hospice because I do feel that there is misconception or fear, or if I make this decision, this means that the end is imminent, or that I don't know if given up is the right word, but I feel like having conversation around what some of those common misunderstandings are, how we can help families really reframe those perceptions, because I am such a proponent of hospice. I think it provides such an incredible support system and brings so much value to that time in our life when we need it. So I would love for you to tell us more about that and what you see and what you've experienced with that.
I think, in my experience, the biggest misconception people have around hospice is that you lose control of your care and what's happening. And that can look a lot of different ways. You know, they take away your medications. They have people tripping through your house. They want to know about your finances because we have social workers. And I think they see that as a loss of identity, a loss of autonomy, a loss of agency. And the truth of it is, hospice teams and hospice workers empower our patients and their caregivers. The way I like to describe it is like a football team. And I think it's important for families, you know, the family caregivers to know this, is that the patient is the coach. The doctor may be the quarterback, and the hospice team are the rest of the players, but the patient or the patient's decision maker is actually the coach. They call the plays, they call the shot. And I think people should have as much control over the way they die, where and how and who they're with, as much as they can. We can't control a lot of the things about death and disease, but we should be able to manage our own decisions about hospice care. And hospice care in the United States empowers people and allows them to flex those rights and those choices. Another misconception that people have about hospice is that we hasten death, right? And that you have to have one foot in the grave and another on the banana peel to be on hospice, when that's not true. People come to us weeks and months before they actually die. So they're on hospice for quite a while. They still qualify for hospice to come on at that stage. But hospice never hastens anything. We don't seek to prolong suffering or life or the dying process, but we never seek to hasten it, ever. We never speed it along or bring death about with the medications we give. It's all about providing comfort and symptom management. But I do think that's one of the things that people get scared of.
I think so too. And I think there isn't always a full awareness of the financial aspect of hospice. So I want to touch on that a little bit, but also the length of time, and that let's say you are on hospice and then your health changes, that you can come off of hospice. I don't know if that's the right technical language around it, but can you share a little bit more about that for people that might not have an understanding of like how it functions?
Sure. So let's talk about the financial piece to start with. Medicare hospice is covered for the patient. Under the regulation, there is a 5% copay that an agency can charge. But I will tell you, in all my 15 years, I have never seen a hospice agency charge a Medicare patient that 5% copay. So everything is furnished basically at 100% coverage. They cover every medication is provided that's related to the patient's symptom management or disease process. They furnish medical equipment, again, at no charge to the patient. So the financial burden is really eased with Medicare hospice. Now, we do have private insurances that also cover hospice for someone who doesn't have Medicare coverage. But that coverage is individualized from insurance plan to insurance plan. So people would need to talk to their insurance carrier before they go on hospice to understand what their costs would be. Time on hospice is another big misconception. People think typically that you have to be actively dying, that your person actually has to be dying to be admitted onto hospice, and that's not the case. You have to have a terminal diagnosis with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, according to a physician. And we do have people that outlive the 6 months. That's great. If they still qualify for hospice and the doctor says they still qualify for hospice, then we'll renew it and the care will keep occurring. If a patient should plateau or get better, which does happen, an agency will tell them, you don't qualify for hospice anymore. So we're going to discharge you. They give you a certain amount of notice. It's again required by regulation that they do that. And they help make discharge plans. So you have another physician, you have a way to get your medicines, and your equipment's going to be there like oxygen. They don't say you're discharged and discharge you off the next day. The care is going to continue long enough to get you all set up before they discharge you off. But yeah, that's a huge misconception about time. So many people come to us late in their disease process, but that's not a requirement for being on hospice.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that is one of the questions that I hear or concerns is, what does that really look like? How do I navigate that time piece? So having clarity helps around that. Thank you.
Sure.
With being a caregiver for your mom, you bring that dual perspective of, right, not only in the professional side, but also personal with your mom. For caregivers that have this emotional, spiritual challenges about caring for someone at the end of life, share with us how you've managed that. And I know, the other side of that is for people in general that struggle with having these conversations, right? Like, how do we do that well? How do we start these conversations? What does that look like?
So, as a family caregiver, I experienced a lot of frustration. And I think it's really important for other caregivers to know this because working in a care profession, working in medical care and nursing the way I do, gave me an advantage when it came to understanding the medical side of things. But living that experience for myself, I'm a caregiver like anybody else. I would have conversations with my mother and hang up the phone and curse and cry, call my brother and say, your mother's being crazy.
Oh.
Just like every other caregiver, I don't think that being in hospice and observing families do this really made me any better at being a caregiver. I think being a caregiver makes me a better hospice nurse.
Mm. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, to really experience that, because watching it from the sidelines and never having it be a personal thing gives you some distance insight to say, well, this is what I could expect if this were my situation. But living it makes me say, I identify with what you're doing. I can validate your feelings, all the grief and the anticipatory grief that you're feeling and the anger, guilt, grief, all of those things, because I'm doing it too. And it is a long process for a lot of folks that are caregivers.
It is. What a beautiful insight in terms of, for us that may be feeling, oh, we don't have all the knowledge or we don't fully understand the intricacies of that, but to know that we don't need to. That's okay. Like us being in that caregiver role, we're all in that together, right? You're not alone in that. And yes, we might have certain insight, but I think that the role of walking through that with your loved one equips you in ways that you wouldn't have been equipped with, right? Through that medical or educational expertise, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the end of life conversations, I was able to have conversations about end of life wishes and things like that with my mom, say 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And she has done her advanced care planning. She's done her estate planning. That was important to her. She's an organized person. She was very well educated, very intelligent lady. And so we had those conversations. My mother could approach it from a very emotionally distant perspective. We never had deep conversations just because she and I never communicated and connected that way. She's a fairly emotionally, I don't want to say repressed, but reserved person. So we never had those conversations that became emotional. It was more practical, logical stuff. And I'm so grateful that we had those conversations about end of life. And I realize now we could not have those conversations in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
She can still converse about things, but her logic is impaired. Her decision making is shot. You know, it would be unfair of me to try to bring up these questions and have those discussions. She and I talked very openly about her end of life wishes in terms that I understood from a work perspective. And I was just sort of planning, and it was practical. But I think when it comes to starting those hard conversations, because don't ever devalue the depth and the impact of those conversations. They are hard. So if you're a caregiver and you're listening to the podcast, you just have to know that we see what you're doing. We know that it's heavy. It's a heavy lift. But if you have those conversations with kindness and respect and compassion, you're not going to make a mistake. You're not going to make a mistake. Love really will guide the conversation. And there are ways to do it that make it a little bit easier and a little bit lighter. There are tons of resources and workbooks. The Conversation Project has a ton of resources, most of them free. There are card games like the End of Life deck and the Death deck that can offer moments for reflection or a little bit of levity. So, you know, if humor is your thing with your person, something a little bit lighter. But there are a lot of tools out there that can guide the conversation so you don't feel like you have to sit down and plan that conversation out. Because I think that can be rather daunting just to get it started.
I agree. And it speaks to having those conversations prior, right, to those events so that it can be maybe done from more of a calm centered place. And I know that's ideal and not always what can happen, but yeah, the importance of that. And then the tools and the resources that are available to help guide you when, when we've never done something before, we've never done it. And so it's okay that we aren't going to do it perfectly, and the love will guide you. I love that advice. Yeah.
You know, one of the things I like to say is an ambulance is a terrible place to have an advanced care plan conversation, right? When you do it in a crisis moment, your decisions, you never have enough time. It's covered with panic and fear, maybe exhaustion, and you're filtering through a brain that's containing all those chemicals, all those issues. So that overwhelm, and then you want to have a serious conversation about whether you want to be placed on a ventilator. If you have those conversations early and then you have them often, right? Because it's never one and done. People change, decision makers change, beliefs change, health status changes. If you have those conversations early, when the crisis part comes, you can be present in a different way without having to handle the burden of decision making quite as much.
Oh, that's great advice. It is. For you personally, have you found that there were things that you implemented for yourself, whether it was like taking care, right? Because we know that a lot of overwhelm can happen as a caregiver. Strategies that you found helpful that you recommend to other people when they're in those moments of deep care, especially when we're emotionally depleted, because I think caregiving, it is not only physically demanding, it's emotionally exhausting, and we need to be filled up again. So I'd love for you to give us a little insight into that.
Sure. So when you're a caregiver for someone, you're providing care for mind, body, and spirit. So you have to turn that care back on yourself, which is so hard to do. I won't whitewash it. I won't say it's easy because it is really hard. Time is usually the biggest consumer, right? Of your energy. So little time for self-care. And I think we throw that word self-care around. It makes you think of bubble baths and a trip to the spa. And for most people, that's out of reach. If you're doing caregiving on a daily basis, those kind of luxurious items take up too much time and money and space that most caregivers don't have. So what I have found is that very, very small increments that can be done frequently, that can be done easily for free in the moment, that don't take any equipment or another person. Those super small, micro, atomic pieces of self-care are really the most beneficial to get you through a day. So one of the things that I do is called box breathing, which is just a breath technique. You don't have to be a nuclear physicist to do it. You don't have to have any equipment. You're already breathing in and out. So it's just a simple technique and an in and out. And it's very calming. And it has physiological effects on your heart rate. It helps release good chemicals. So you're actually benefiting yourself, mind, body, and spirit when you do it. One of the other techniques that I've used is saying a healthy mantra when you're doing a load of laundry, when you're cleaning something, when you're driving to get groceries. I do that a lot. Now, it's easy to say mantras that are cranky, involve bad words, judging yourself. If you're using the word stupid in a mantra, that's not the right way to go. You have to change it. It has to be a mantra that is uplifting, and it can be something as simple as a string of words that you find powerful or comforting. I had a mantra for a while that I used when I was falling asleep, and it was strength, courage, love, oh my gosh, healing, and capability. And love was always in the middle because that was the pillar, that was the touchstone of everything. But it was just a set of words. And so it can be completely individualized. You can make it fit you. If those words don't have meaning for you, if you're a person of deep faith, hope, love, compassion, respect. Faith, hope, love, compassion, and respect. And you're just repeating it as a mantra. And I found that kind of thing to be really helpful.
I love that advice. And just a great reminder to lean into that, when we need that. There's a lot of grief as we're walking through this time of life, and it's very personal, and we all navigate that differently. For you, as you're in this, I would say, role of caring for others, but caring for yourself, have you found that there are ways that you prepare yourself emotionally for the loss and still be present in care as you work with families? As we're walking through this process, can you share with us more about what does that look like? And I know it looks different for everyone, but in your experience.
So for me personally, I try to remind myself that my mother can't remember. And I lean very heavily on my siblings. And I think it's very important to create a caregiving village. Not every caregiver has that luxury. It takes time if you don't have that built-in family caregiving unit. But for me, that has been very important. I also started saying a mantra before I even have a phone call with my mom, because I'm a remote caregiver, right? So most of my contact with my mother on a daily basis has been phone conversations, often convoluted and confused. But I would say a mantra, and it was just a way of preparing myself and getting the good chemicals and the good mindset flowing. I think it's important to be self-aware of what is aggravating or what amps up your frustration or your anxiety. There are certain things with me that drive me crazy about my interactions with my mom. And I hear this from other caregivers when I do navigation sessions. There's certain things that bother them that they hold on to. And
Mhm.
relationships are messy,
Mhm.
right? They were messy before we got to a terminal diagnosis or a caregiving role. So it's important to recognize there's a term, emotional agility. It basically means taking that emotion out, having a look at it, examining it, and saying, this is something that causes me anxiety. So if you can do that, you're looking at it with a little bit of distance, a little bit of objectivity. And then that's when you create something, a habit or a ritual, a practice for yourself so that you're preparing yourself for the next caregiving task, the next caregiving role that you're going to have.
It's important to look at that. And I think specifically with hospice, right, we know what's coming. And so the importance of having those reflections, and we're all wired different ways, right? And you said relationships are complicated, but
Sure.
yeah, just the importance of that. For caregivers, when we experience loss, right, when that happens, have you found or witnessed, right, in the hospice community for us as we're in this bereavement to have meaning and to have healing? And I know for all of us that looks different, but what are your thoughts on that?
When I think about people who are dealing with grief after a death, you know, self-care is still so important, but grief can be so heavy that it's hard to see how to do that. And there's not a manual.
Mhm.
There's not a manual for these things. And the grief that a person can experience is such a mixed bag. You may have the sadness, you may have the longing, for your person, but there also may be anger and guilt and resentment, relief, maybe a little bit of joy for all sorts of different reasons. You know, there's concern about other people judging your grief style. The way I think about grief is like it's your wardrobe, right? After you have a loss.
Mhm.
So this is the outfit you put on today. Maybe it doesn't feel great. Maybe the pants are a little too tight, but maybe this is the color that you want to wear today and this is your style today, right? And everybody's outfit is a little bit different. Everybody's grief style is just a little bit different.
I love that analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. So the next day, maybe you feel a little bit lighter. So your grief style looks a little bit different that day.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to give yourself a lot of grace when it comes to that. In hospice, according to the regulations, a hospice agency provides bereavement care for that family for up to a year after the patient dies, right? But
My
what
next
we,
question is, how does hospice support grief? So
yeah.
I love that you touched on that. You read my mind. Yeah.
Well,
Perfect.
what we know now, evidence-based, is that the peak of grieving after a personal loss like that is actually 18 to 36 months after the death. Yeah, you do experience those firsts, the first birthday, the first set of holidays, the first death anniversary. Those first can be really hard. But if you ask somebody who's lost somebody they really care about, they could tell you, she's been dead 15 years, and every year on her birthday, I remember.
Mm.
And I have a cup of coffee at her favorite place, you know. I think rituals are a really good way to manage grief and bereavement. I think that's really important. I actually remember my grandmother who helped raise me every year at Christmas because she made all of her grandchildren little felt stockings with sequins and she hung them on the Christmas tree. And I have the ones that belong to me and my husband and my two kids. And I hang them every year on my Christmas tree. And even now, see, I can feel the tears super close. And I have to tell you, she died in 2000. So she's been gone 24 years. I can still tap into that grief. I still feel it.
Yeah, the rituals. It's so true. It's a way of, yeah, remembering, keeping
Yeah.
those memories alive. Yeah,
Yeah. It's their legacy and it's okay to look on to that and to hold it close. It's
yeah,
good to do that.
really is. Do you find that families have conversations about those rituals before that passing in hospice, or does it vary for each, yeah, for each individual?
I think it varies some. But I've been at so many bedsides where that family's sitting around and maybe the patient is no longer able to participate in the conversation, but the family is there and they have the tears and the joy flowing at the same time because they're remembering some goofball event or some crazy thing that grandma did or some habit that mom had that drove them crazy. You know, grandpa always had peppermints in his pocket and he smelled like peppermints all the time, or he smelled like pipe tobacco all the time. And they share these stories and they talk about these things. And that it's sort of an end of life ritual, life review, even when the patient's no longer able to participate. And I think there is incredible power, incredible joy, and limitless comfort in having those conversations like that.
Yeah.
That to me, that's an end of life ritual. And people do that at memorial services and funerals as well. It's all about storytelling.
They do. I was doing a podcast we were talking about Carrie Albers, so Gather Darlings, and we had our best friends on, and we were sharing about the importance too of not waiting till the funeral or when someone's no longer in our life to tell them all the things that we loved and reflected, on about them, and just the reminder of that, because I do think that it's such a reminder to be present in those moments while you can be, So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, just thinking through that, it's been more weighing on me as well of the importance of saying the things, telling someone you care about them or what you love about them is, yeah, just a good reminder.
Yeah. Yeah. Let those things flow. It's okay. It feels sad and it can hurt.
Mhm.
But if you have the chance to say those things, it really is healing.
Yeah.
Some of the things you want to say aren't as nice. And
Mhm.
I think it's okay to say those things too. I wish things could have been different.
Mhm.
I wish I had never done this and this. I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
Mhm.
Or I forgive you.
Mhm.
That happens too. You know, for folks with neurological diseases, dementia, Alzheimer's, and things like that, there comes a point when those conversations can't happen. And so having them when you can becomes even more important.
Yeah, it does. In these conversations about grief, part of that grief is we're having to make really tough decisions at the end of life and end of life care. How do you guide families through these difficult decisions, right? There is how do we know when to discontinue treatments? How do we know when to focus on comfort care? Those advanced directives, all of those questions that we have that we might not know how to do.
There are two pieces of advice that I usually offer families when they're having to make those really, really hard decisions. First of all, listen to your healthcare team. They are the experts in the healthcare part and the medical treatment part. And the second piece of advice I offer is listen to your person and listen to their body. Your body knows what it's doing, and it'll give you all the signals and signs that you need to know to make these decisions. For instance, one of the biggest issues we see people have to struggle with is discontinuing treatment, chemotherapy, things like that. People's bodies have a way of telling them, I can't tolerate this. It's making me sicker than I was to begin with. I've had enough. I can't manage any more of it. And their spirits and minds will say, I'm tired. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be at home. I want things to be simple. And when you make decisions based on those things with the guidance of your healthcare team, you're not going to make a misstep.
Mm.
And I think for caregivers, it's so difficult to make a decision for someone else or to look at their person from the outside and respect their decision not to go forward with treatment. Because from the outside, it can look easy. Oh, you could do another round of chemo. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. But for the person, it's not fine and it's hard. So respecting their choice is super important. Another big decision that people struggle with is feeding and eating towards the end of life. And the best way I've ever heard that explained is when your person stops eating, their appetite diminishes and they stop eating, is to remember they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying. That's from a colleague of mine, Dr. Matthew Tyler, from an organization called How to Train Your Doctor. And so that's how he counsels patients and families. Yeah, they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying.
What a powerful reframe.
And that's all about listening to your body. Listening to your body. It can't digest it. It doesn't tolerate it well. It backs up. It feels bad. It causes vomiting and nausea and bloating, and you're losing weight anyway. Listen to what your body's telling you. But those hard decisions should never be taken lightly. They carry a lot of impact for the person who's sick and for the caregivers.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's going to resonate and be really insightful for people listening as we walk through that. Yeah. There is, hospice has been around for how many years? I don't even know, formally.
Oh, wow. I don't know. The Dame
Oh,
Cicely
right.
Saunders, it's been years.
Right.
The Medicare benefit
Mhm.
launched in the mid 80s here in the United States, but the modern hospice movement was started over in Great Britain, in London by Dame Cicely Saunders years before that. And she brought it here, lectured here, and then it just lit fire across the country.
Oh, wow. And it's evolved throughout the years. And I'm sure you've seen that in the course of your work. How have you seen it evolve? And where do you see it going? Do you see trends happening? What has your experience been watching the movement of hospice?
When hospice started in the United States, before the benefit was set into place, the hospice benefit was set into place. That's before my time in hospice, but it was pretty much manned by volunteers. And of course, once the governmental benefit was established, that brought regulation into us.
Mhm.
We have a great use of interdisciplinary teams, multidisciplinary teams, which is so important. We're bringing in all these skilled folks with different gifts and talents and things to offer. And I have seen it evolved to where, unfortunately, we're so highly regulated that a lot of what we do doesn't make sense to the caregiver at the bedside. But I will tell you, there's a method behind the madness. There always is. So I ask you just to give your team some grace, ask questions when you need to, and expect to get an answer. You should get an answer. But there is a method behind the madness. There's a reason for what we do. I also see it changing going forward in the future to include the role of the end-of-life doula, the death doulas. So a doula is like a guide. We hear of them most of the time in the role of a birth doula, someone who helps a mom as through a pregnancy and through birth. But this is a death doula, someone who companions a family and a patient as they approach end of life. It doesn't have to be at the last minute. It can be weeks to months to years prior to a death, but to companion, to teach. They're not clinical and they're not licensed, so they're not nursing. They're not providing that type of care, but they provide a lot of grief support. They're fantastic at having advanced care plan conversations. And more I see people either hiring doulas privately or doulas becoming part of hospice teams to add that extra layer in of support at the bedside. That's a newer thing. And I think we're heading more and more in that direction.
A great support system. Yeah, it really is that whole team approach.
Awesome. Yeah, I absolutely think so.
There is so much we've learned from you today. And as a parting wisdom, I'd love for you to share what piece of advice would you give us if we're facing this end of life journey with our loved one?
To anybody who's listening who is walking this path with somebody that they care about, I would tell you, take your time. Give yourself that grace to just be who you are. You don't have to be a superhero. You don't have to do it all. Be yourself along the way. If that means humor, anger, however your grief expresses itself, as long as it's a healthy expression, then just be yourself. You're not going to get it wrong. You're not going to get it wrong if you do it with love and kindness.
And for people that are wanting to learn more from you, wanting to connect with you, where can we do that? And looking at your work, share with us what you see and the impact that you're making and how we can come alongside you and celebrate the work that you're doing as well.
Well, my biggest role these days is as host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. We're talking about everything related to end-of-life care and death and dying with some fantastic industry experts. You can listen to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform, of course, but also on my website, theheartofhospice.com. I also work to support the caregiving community at end of life with a service called Hospice Navigation Services, where someone with a need for information about end-of-life care can connect on theheartofhospice.com and set up a navigation session with me. And they can do it by phone or by video. Just book a time that's convenient for them. And we can have a conversation about anything you need to talk about when it comes to end of life. We can troubleshoot the current hospice care that you're getting right now. If you have a concern or a question about it, we can talk about advanced care planning. If we do a video call and you want to talk for an hour, I have an hour-long session that can include 2 to 3 people. So it's a great way to bring everybody together and have them getting the same information at the same time, which is really helpful when you're trying to navigate a hospice experience. So theheartofhospice.com is the best way to connect with me.
That sounds great. And we'll include those links. And what an incredible resource, specifically at this time in life when we really, really need that extra support. So thank you for your important work. Thank you for having these conversations. Thank you for sharing with us today. And it's just a joy to finally meet you and have you on.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been awesome to be with you.
Thank you.
Are you looking for more support and community? We sure are. That is why I'm so happy to highlight one of my favorite podcasts in the caregiving community, Confessions of a Reluctant Caregiver, hosted by my friends and sisters, Natalie Elliott Handy and JJ Elliott Hill. They offer a unique blend of personal storytelling, expert advice, and candid conversations that shed light on the real-life challenges and triumphs that caregivers face. Tune in to Confessions of a Reluctant Caregiver wherever you enjoy your podcasts, or explore more on their website at www.confessionsofareluctantcaregiver.com. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.